connectivity, the role of digital devices from Ukraine to the Sahel. And today we're aiming to unpack how digital devices, and specifically smartphones, are reshaping crises across the globe. We've got examples from Ukraine, we've got examples from Somalia, from Mali, from Iraq, and from other places as well. This event is also the launch of our special section. This was published in the Journal of International Affairs earlier in the year, and the title for that was The Crisis in the Palm of Our Hand, Smartphones in Context of Conflict and Care. In light of the debates that this special section then subsequently sparked, we took the occasion basically to facilitate a broader discussion. And the idea here is also to bring together academia, policymakers, and practitioners into the same conversation. So yeah, it's great to see so many faces here, and even more of you on the live stream as well. And we hope for a lively discussion, basically. So why the smartphone? I mean, everyone kind of knows what a smartphone is, right? I imagine everyone here uses one, probably checked it in the last half an hour, maybe even checking it now, some of you. But particularly in the last 5 years, the global spread of cheap smartphone handsets has been profound. And what was once just a communication device is now pretty integral, actually, to how crises unfold, how information is disseminated, and even how conflicts are fought. So in my own research in Somalia, upon arrival to a rural village, elders who would once greet outsiders with a stick in one hand would now greet me with a stick in one hand and a smartphone in the other. And we realized that basically other researchers were having similar experiences with this. So we brought them all together in Copenhagen last year. Some are bona fide experts in the digital. Others, most of us probably are just scholars that have been working for some time in different conflict zones, but that found that smartphones are sort of reshaping our work in ways that we hadn't necessarily anticipated. And so this section, the special section that followed this meeting of minds, examined this rapid and global proliferation of smartphones. And in essence, our argument is basically that smartphones reshape how we understand, how we experience, but also how we participate in various forms of crises around the world. And so the key takeaway that we want to sort of hammer home today is basically that smartphones are not just tools for communication. They're in fact deeply embedded in the fabric of crisis themselves.
Yeah, so today's speakers will take you on a tour to some of the world's hotspots of crisis, and exploring how connectivity is reshaping how states, humanitarian and non-state actors conceptualize and respond to crisis. And in our first section, our dear co-editor, Matthew Ford and Tetyana Lokot will take us to the war in Ukraine and exploring the impact of participatory warfare. Here, soldiers, but also civilians, utilize smartphones to document events, share information, and even directly contribute to military efforts, blurring the boundaries between civilians and combatants. In the second section, we move into how digital media is spilling conflicts over into other global conflict zones. And here, Michael Inez, Jethro, and I will look at how digital connectivity affects the conflicts in Mali, Iraq, and Somalia. After the break, Daniel Møller, Ølgaard, and Liza Ann Richey and Rune Saugmann will address how smartphone technology impacts humanitarian actors and Black Lives Matter activists. And finally, our tech ambassador, Ditte Bjerregaard, will give you some very privileged insights from the practitioner's view on how to govern the ever more powerful global tech industry. We're very grateful for all the speakers for coming and to our brilliant colleagues Anders Puk Nielsen, Florian Weigand and Adam Feiersgaard, who will provide comments to the sessions. And last but not least, Peer, for being willing to facilitate the final discussion. So collectively, the presentations reflect some of the main findings that is coming out of a special section, namely, smartphones impact global crisis. I think we said that a few times now.
Maybe, yeah.
But it's because of these very unique features and affordances they have. That is speed. They allow information to spread instantly, ever faster. And the audio visibility. It's not just messages and phone calls. We share pictures, videos, live streams on apps like WhatsApp, YouTube, Facebook, and TikTok. And this makes the crises and events feel even more real, and it also influences how people react to them. And finally, scalability is important. It's not just one-to-one anymore. The smartphones and particularly the app infrastructure allows groups of hundreds to thousands of people to connect and communicate and coordinate events across geographical boundaries. These features contribute to what we have termed global crisis ecologies, that is, interconnected spaces where individuals, governments, and non-state actors engage with crises in real time, no matter where they are in the world. And using this framework, the case studies show how smartphones are changing conflict dynamics, humanitarian response, and political participation in governments. So Jethro, this is your favorite. Why is this important for policymakers?
I love policy, yeah. So firstly, I think we need to recognize smartphones as more than just simply communication tools. They're not just these neutral conduits for information. They're active agents, even, that shape the dynamics of crisis and conflict itself. And this has a couple of important policy implications. The first of which concerns the regulation of big tech and the companies and infrastructure that provide the basis or undergird the sort of structures through which smartphones become hyper-connected. As many of you know, these platforms and their algorithms can and basically are being exploited for spreading misinformation and for inciting violence. We've heard recently that AI is now going to be integrated into smartphone handsets, so this is something that's particularly salient as well. And then secondly, another thing that we've been discussing a lot is the need to adapt legal frameworks, particularly international humanitarian law, to the realities of digital warfare. As we'll hear from others here, smartphones are implicated in blurring the lines between civilians and combatants in quite interesting and unique ways. And there's a lot of challenges at the moment for international law, for civilian protection in that regard. We've waxed lyrical about how smartphones are sort of proliferating across the globe, but there are also a lot of digital divides that obviously still exist. And this unequal access to information and connectivity has a lot of profound implications also for crisis response and humanitarian activity. It can exacerbate existing inequalities, it can hinder effective communication, and so on. But, and academics are always very critical, there is also important to recognize that it can also offer opportunities for peace building and humanitarian response. So there is potential, essentially, for harnessing some of the power of smartphones and hyperconnectivity, for example, in coordinating aid, documenting human rights abuses, empowering citizen journalism, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, but with this seminar, we really embrace the opportunity to both encourage continuous academic analysis and proactive policy making to navigate the ever more complex challenges and opportunities presented by the smartphone in our increasingly hyper-connected world. But before I give the floor to the first speakers, there's a few thank yous. First of all, this seminar is funded by the DIIS FSPS agreement and the Carlsberg Foundation. And the workshop and the editing of the special issue was generously funded by the DIIS Tech Initiative. Also thanks to all the authors and also thanks to International Affairs for supporting the live stream, because we might be all of you here, but there's hundreds of people following on the live stream as well. So thanks for that support. And there's also copies of the special section that you can grab after the wine reception. But without further ado, now I'll leave the floor to Matthew, who will unpack how smartphones shape the Ukrainian battlefields. Thank you very much.
Sorry.
Technical. Now I can hear the feedback. Very good. Good afternoon. Great to see so many people in the room, and I don't know how many people we've got online, but I'm looking forward to having some conversations with you guys too. My name is Matthew Ford. I'm going to set a timer. We've got, what, about 10 minutes? Is that where we are? Okay, good. So I'm going to talk to you about Ukraine, and I am going to talk to you about some of my research and locate it within. I'm going to actually talk you through how I approached trying to make sense of what I'm seeing on my phone. I think that's pretty much what I'm going to do. And I don't know about you, but if you're carrying a smartphone, you're on your way to work, you could be very much inundated with images of war, and they're out of sequence, there's no chronology, it's kind of confusing. You can quickly switch off and turn to images of cats and other video content. You can change the platform that you might be looking at from X to YouTube to Telegram to TikTok. And each of them have their own ecologies and ways of working, different cultures, different people involved, different demographic profiles, and it can be very, very overwhelming. So a lot of what I'm trying to do here is just pull you through how I went about making sense of some of the things that we're seeing online, with a view to understanding how war is not just represented through our smartphone, but also conducted. And because I never miss an opportunity to make a sales pitch, I wanted to plug my book, Radical War, which I co-wrote with Andrew Hoskins, where we wrote this book 2 years ago and published it in March 2022. And there's nothing like a conventional land war in Europe to make you realize that any ideas that you might have presented in this book are now going to be put to the test. And the question in my mind was, how wrong is this book? And so for the last 2 years, I've been really trying to make sense of what I'm seeing on my smartphone, with a view to trying to make sense as to, actually, was there anything in this book or not? Because it's intensely confusing. War in Ukraine is the most documented war in history. There are the 11 years of war in Syria produced something like 5 million conflict records of war crimes. In the first 4 months of the war in Ukraine, you got 2.8 million digital records. So it's a huge amount of material being produced. And of course, the means for producing that material are these devices, our smartphones. This is how we are participating in the conflict, and it's shaping that participation can happen whether we are on a tube in London when we're just retweeting something, or whether we're actually directly on the front lines. Now, one of the things that came out of Radical War was the idea that we advanced the idea that you could think of the smartphone as a weapon. Now, I remember giving the book to a couple of people in my war studies community, and they absolutely scoffed at the idea. But increasingly, you can see that and the hypothesis I want to run with you here is that what we're seeing is actually a collapse of what you might call a targeting cycle, and how we are producing, publishing, and consuming media. And on the right-hand side, we talk about participation. This is the uniqueness of this device, of course, is that as I said, you can produce, publish, and consume media, and you can do it instantly without much in the way of oversight. And the only kind of constraint on that would be whatever the policies are of the social media platform. And if you're not going to publish to social media, you're going to transmit via private instant messaging. That's between you and whoever you're broadcasting to. On the left-hand side, a targeting cycle. This is just a classic targeting cycle about how armed forces collect information. They find and then find the enemy. Then they fix and finish, and then they go round the loop. They gather up information that they've found on the target, digital information. This is from JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command in Iraq in the 2000s. And then you exploit the information that you found on the target, digital media, analog media, or whatever, and then you go around the cycle again. And so if we think of the smartphone as a weapon, the question is whether targeting and participation have collapsed into each other, whether anyone with a smartphone can go through the process of enabling the targeting cycle in some way, shape, or form. But before, we need to understand how we got there. I mean, and if you remember, some of you, I'm old enough to remember this. I'm not going to assume you're all old enough to remember this. But, if you remember from the 1991 Gulf War, the way war was mediated was very much top-down by a press office in the command headquarters, holding a press conference a bit like this and then briefing people, and they would show videos of various vehicles or things being destroyed. That whole approach to mainstream media has, of course, fundamentally changed. To the point where anyone with a smart device can get online and they can broadcast all this stuff, but they also controlling drones and then rebroadcasting information via taken from the drone out across social media, and importantly, from a Ukrainian point of view, an app designed to allow people to directly participate in the targeting exercise is also something that's going on. And the result is that, as you said, there's a speed and scale of information being provided that and this is an Israeli example, but within, if you see here 1245, you go from 2.6 million views to 4.6 million views. So the virality of some of this the imagery of war can be out of control and can really be very, very upsetting, as this particular example is. Online, of course, you're in an environment where experts are clashing all the time. There's no sense of who is the expert and how should we judge and evaluate what we're seeing. And here you can see forensic architecture and Shashank Joshi, from the defense editor of The Economist, in a conversation about what is going on in this particular moment in Gaza. And that's a function of mainstream media itself not necessarily having all the tools associated with doing open source intelligence. And that's where crowdsourcing intelligence through social media can work. And that is reflected even in academia. Academia doesn't necessarily have the tools necessary to go into online and find out what's going on. So you've got very, very different frames of reference, frames of understanding. On the left-hand side, we've got a military targeting cycle where information is working according to military dynamics. In the middle, you've got a mainstream media platform which is very hierarchical. You've got editorial policies and processes that shape and control the speed at which information can come through. In the middle, you've got participative media, which is in conflict and in churns with mainstream media on a regular basis, creating the kinds of confusion that we are regularly confronted with. Do we believe the mainstream media impression, or do we take it the view from someone who's actually there recording something and broadcasting it live? Are they more giving you something more real, more truthful? And then at the back end of that, we've got the challenge of making sense of all of these things. So if that's our problem, I'm putting it to you, that's our kind of problem. The question is how we might make sense of these different frames of understanding. And the way I have done it is twofold. One, I created an open source intelligence team to try and go out and investigate what we could see and find in the war in Ukraine. That's prompted the article that I wrote, which is free to download, so you don't, there's no point me repeating it all here, but which would allow you to, you have the expertise necessary to make sense of what's going on online, what's actually happening in battle and not. The other thing to do is to think about the stack. What are the information infrastructures that make it possible to get this information to us, and how? And this is what I would put to you, that we need to understand this. We need to do a digital anthropology of the stack. We need to understand how the stack is constructed. We need to understand the various different layers and types of actor involved in the stack, so that we can start to see how images of war are mediated and delivered to us by our smartphone. The underlying truth behind participation and war is a reality that civilian communications are much, much, much more effective and stronger than military. You can see that here. Top part of the graph is just looking at 2G to 5G technology. Bottom half, if you look down the bottom, all the military comms, their data transmission rates on the left-hand side are tiny by comparison to civilian. And so inevitably, military information infrastructures end up piggybacking off civilian, which creates the basis around which participation and civilian participation in conflict, where anyone with a smartphone can engage in war, is possible. And that itself reflects something as simple and elementary as investment cycles. The venture capital investment in civilian information technology far, far outstrips that of the investments made in military technology. Military information technology consumed 25% of investment capital in 1975, and now in 1999 consumed about 2%. So you can see that the basis upon which everything else is happening right now is, without being technologically determinist about it, but it's framed by changes in the underlying technology infrastructure that now everyone can carry in the palm of their hands. So last but not least, because I can never miss an opportunity to plug a book, I'm just finished writing this. Will be with my publisher Hearst in the next month or so, and will come out next year. And here I'm trying to contextualize what is going on in terms of participating in war and the ongoing discussions around the revolutions in AI. And it's my suggestion that participatory warfare is really a stopping point on the AI story. The military AI has not yet been made to work, and so inevitably we are bringing civilians into the picture to be part of that targeting and conduct of war exercise. There we go.
Make sure I've unmuted myself. All right. So as the social scientist in the room, I'm going to sort of pick up where Matthew left off, and take some of what he said about, you know, the really expanding role of smartphones and digital technology in war, but also take a more citizen-focused angle. There is an ongoing conversation about the role that citizens have been playing in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and how active, in particular, Ukrainian citizens have been. If you know anything at all about the history of Ukraine, this might not come as such a surprise. Ukraine has a long history of national resistance and civic network building, and this has obviously translated in more recent times also in mobilizing against authoritarian threats. So if you may have heard about the Euromaidan or the Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine in 2014, where citizens essentially embraced digital technology, but also used it as a part of their ongoing historic learning of civic mobilization. So for Ukrainians, digital media is not only something that they use every day, it's also something that they are used to interpreting in more political ways. The other thing that's worth knowing about Ukrainian citizens is that they have also held a kind of traditional mistrust of centralized government. And so even in more recent times, they've relied on the openness and power of horizontal mobilization for collective action, and have kind of worked in parallel to government reform or government work. And this has also, to some extent, has been true in during Russia's full-scale invasion, because a lot of the citizen-supported mobilization has actually happened in parallel or away from centralized authority. At the same time, in territories of Ukraine which were occupied by Russia, first in 2014 and later on in 2022, we also see the rise of something we call networked authoritarianism, right? Where Russia has basically brought its authoritarian logic into these territories that has already been applied elsewhere on Russian land. And it's essentially subjected Ukrainian citizens to surveillance, censorship, shutdowns, by basically taking control of the digital and communications infrastructure. So this results in two different realities, and I want to focus obviously on the participation of Ukrainian citizens in warfare across these realities. But to say that, there are opportunities that digital media give to citizens to participate in conflicts by engaging in multiple activities. But the one thing I want to focus on today is how citizens create knowledge about what it's like to live through a war and what it's like to participate in war. And, you know, how do the limitations and affordances of all of these technologies that we've been talking about, the smartphones, digital media platforms, chat messenger apps, what impact do they have on citizens' participation in war, but also on their epistemic agency, the power to produce knowledge? It's true that politics in general and even geopolitics has become more personal in an era of digital media, partly because participating in warfare becomes easier when we can actually get access to news and information about the war through our personal devices, but also because the war in Ukraine has been reaching everything, and it's been affecting all aspects of life. So war has become a part of life, and therefore documenting the war and producing knowledge about the war is also becoming part of everybody's everyday practices. What's interesting is that when these mundane practices start to coalesce in something that seems to be a bit more strategic, right, and where we see people kind of doing certain types of things online and also not doing other things, because they understand that this is part of how they participate in the resistance to Russian aggression. Ukrainian resistance to Russian invasion has been called maybe, you know, the most documented war of our time. But it's certainly only illuminated some of the things that have also been happening in other parts of the world, where people have also been using smartphones, other personal devices, and other digital technologies to preserve a record of what was happening to them, but also to push back against what they see as a threat to their everyday life. But certainly citizen participation in war through digital media has made the war a lot more human and a lot more personal for a lot of people. Nonetheless, as citizens adjust to participating in the war through all of these devices that mediate their experiences, that connect them in their processes of knowledge production, we should also not forget that there is a complex ecosystem underlying all of these seemingly mundane communications, from the cat photos to videos of drones being shot down by missiles or by artillery. There is a multitude of digital platforms, each of them with their own business interests, which have nothing to do with participating in the war or supporting citizens. But these platforms also have their own logics, right? The algorithms, sometimes hidden, are geared towards more engagement, sometimes through showing us the most explosive content and the most objectionable content. Governments that seek to regulate these platforms also have different interests, from controlling the information space to ensuring free speech and freedom of expression. So understanding how citizens manage this complex ecosystem is very important, because despite the attempts to control, either through algorithmic logics or through state repression or through moderation, all of these systems, citizens still find ways of creating knowledge and spreading that knowledge about the war. So some of the things that we've observed in Ukraine, where people are trying to achieve not only visibility, because it's important for them to make visible what is happening to them in times of war, but they're also stressing that these are individual experiences. They're not shying away from the emotional nature of their wartime knowledge. And this is something that pushes against the traditional logics of expertise, right, where we're used to trusting people who are experts at something. And we traditionally tend to distrust or show epistemic injustice toward people who are living in this country and directly experiencing it. There seems to be this change in the logic of networked expertise, where people are actually saying it's because I'm directly affected and it's because I'm having these emotional and very violent experiences that you should trust me, right? Because I have firsthand knowledge. So this pushes back against traditional media logics, against traditional kind of institutionalized expertise logics. But in a way, this is something that we learn has a lot of impact in networked spaces. And so it's really important to account for that. But there are a whole range of wartime knowledge production practices in Ukraine where people do everything from ordinary citizens, from trying to frame what the war is about, explain why it's happening, who is involved, trying to set the agenda. People are also engaging in personal storytelling, posting testimonies, whether it's soldiers on the battlefield or people telling stories of displacement, occupation, resistance, trauma, and grief. So this creates a kind of constant feed of mediated witnessing where people are sharing their very emotional first-hand experiences of the war and how it's affecting them. But people are also then placing these experiences into context. A lot of the work that we saw Ukrainians do and continue to see them do is issuing corrections, saying you shouldn't call it the Ukraine war. You shouldn't call it Russia's special operation. You should call it Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which is also illegal. So this process of articulation is very important because very often it actually pushes against some of the more traditional expertise, which insists that, you know, we should only use these very measured terms. And it's actually bringing us closer to the surface, to the actual battlefield where all these things are happening. Obviously, knowledge production doesn't just stop at providing historical and political context. It also places these facts in the context of the legacies of colonialism, conquest, and resistance that Ukraine has gone through. And it also goes on to assign blame on responsibility, calling out specific actors. A very common refrain that you will hear is Ukrainians on social media saying it's not Putin's war, it's Russia's war. So it's not just one person who is pushing all the buttons and producing missiles in a factory and, you know, cutting off heads of prisoners of war and putting civilians into dungeons. These are all multiple people, you know, coming from the same country. The other important work that goes into knowledge production on a citizen level is collecting evidence and documentation. And it's obviously a really fraught process because not all evidence that is collected by civilians and posted on social media is admissible in court. But it nonetheless creates this ongoing ephemeral record of the war and will play a part in forming the history of the war. Of course, other more important knowledge production activities also have to do with developing civilian expertise in areas such as fundraising, volunteering, providing volunteer medical aid on the battlefield, assisting in humanitarian efforts. All of these are part of the increasing repository of wartime knowledge that Ukrainians are contributing to. So while they present their wartime reality as part of their daily life, they also stress that the war isn't just an intellectual exercise and it's not just happening somewhere far, far away on the battlefield. It's a bodily experience. And by sharing knowledge about how the war is affecting them, Ukrainians are also centering ordinary bodies as vessels of knowledge, right? Where they bring together their shared histories and experiences. They're also deliberately highlighting the visibility of the micro-level practices. And they're saying that war isn't just grand strategies and geopolitics. War is everyday little things that happen to people that together make up the reality of the impact that, you know, somebody's act of brutal aggression is having on civilian population or the military, you know, somewhere on the front line. So in a way, right, they push against this logic of traditional expertise and they validate being emotional, right, where emotional expression is strategically rationalized and it becomes an important aspect of what is acceptable to discuss about the war and what things are permissible to talk about, you know, in prime time in traditional media. So key concerns of citizens in wartime and articulating the relevant knowledge reframes our conversation about how we talk about war and how we talk about its impact on the military, the civilian, the state, the national, the local. And so we have, as a result, Ukrainians providing all of these disclosures about their experiences of war online, this emotionally infused knowledge production gives rise to new kinds of epistemic agency. So it enables people to share knowledge and makes it powerful because it reframes political or military narratives around people's own experiences and personal histories. And it recontextualizes this emotional and mundane content and documentation of war as rational and legitimate. So I think for me, the final takeaway I would say would be that these tools and examples of knowledge production and these types of epistemic agency that are visible in the Ukrainian context are reflexive, embodied, and they're socially situated, but they're very important to grasp for governments, international organizations, and military and defense bodies, because they explain the changing nature of participatory warfare. It's an assemblage of media practices, citizen identity negotiation, knowledge production, but they also change the power relations between citizens, states, and militaries. And I think they should account for citizen digital media knowledge production in the strategic and military planning, and it's really important to understand how this activity can impact the everyday wartime operations, but also manage global perceptions and knowledge about what it's like to fight wars today in an interconnected world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya. And now Anders Puk Nielsen from the Danish Defense College will provide his inputs.
Yes, thank you. And thank you for this opportunity to reflect on these two very, very interesting presentations. I think I will start with the idea that Matthew and Tanya as well, you both talk about this participatory element that the smartphone enables, that everyone can be part of the conflict as well. I guess one of the interesting things about it is also the borderlessness of this, right? The internet is ubiquitous, and that means you don't actually have to be in the place anymore to be a part of the conflict. Everyone can have opinions about whatever is going on from far, far away. And a lot of the content that we consume today is stuff that is made from videos on the front line. We have frontline units sending back these images for broad consumption in the West, in the rest of Ukraine, everywhere in the world. But we also have people from everywhere in the world having their opinions about what should be going on the front line, trying to influence things. And I have a question I would like to ask you, Matthew, about this, about what are the consequences on a broader scale going to be of this whole participatory thing? And the reason I'm asking that is that participation can sound like a very sort of positive, enabling thing. We are empowered to take responsibility and those kinds of things. But I think when we talk about war, then participation could also be something worrisome. Right? We can definitely see that I think people have a tendency to be more courageous when they're not on the front line themselves, like about what should other people do and what kind of violence should go on over there. You know, especially when we get into text, I think we've all tried that. We write some kind of very angry email that we probably wouldn't have said things like that if we were actually face to face. Right? So what are the consequences of this in terms of the direction of the world, really? Well, are we heading into, is this like some kind of dystopian future we're heading into that because the smartphone enables these kinds of things?
That's a nice a nice post-lunch question. I think, well, first off, I think what we're in a situation where the device is sort of technologically embedded a blurring between the line of civilian and armed forces. So for academics and for people working in international law, there's always a discussion about where the civilian who is the civilian, at what point they will be named civilian. You know, that boundary is important because a whole heap of legal international law type questions follow, right? But that blurring between civilian and military as categories has been going on for some considerable time and is constantly in flux. I guess though the technology we're talking about here starts to embed this blurring between civilian and military, because in effect you are, if you're on the grid, then you are part of you're providing metadata, and that metadata can inform and shape all sorts of organizations, companies, intelligence, both private sector and government, and invariably private sector are providing information that is used by government. So there are a number of companies out there that just collecting open source can track how people are living, and that sort of pattern of life information then becomes very, very influential in terms of shaping when something out of the ordinary is going to happen, and that can be very useful insight for some kind of military activity. But you go right down to the battlefield. Just by carrying a smartphone, you are effectively providing data, but you could also actively participate, and that makes you, there is, when you download an app that says if you provide information, film an enemy column, that information will then be transmitted back to an intelligence cell. That intelligence cell will then disseminate that information to artillery units, who will then may then target the bit of the people that you're recording. If there's no tick box on your app that says you realise that you will sacrifice your rights as a non-combatant, right? Then effectively you're part of the kill chain. You've extended the kill chain out into the general public. Now, the implication there is that you've got a real challenge about distinguishing civilian from military, and the response by big military AI companies is to collect more data. If we can get more data, then we'll eventually be able to pass the difference between a civilian and a combatant. But increasingly, and my suggestion is that the digital tech, smart devices, are going to make that, if they haven't already, made that impossible. So, the challenge of civilian and military and how that has completely blurred is a real challenge, I think, in terms of how warfighting can continue, and about whether ordinary civilians have rights and under what circumstances. If you carry a smartphone, then you can be part of the kill chain, you can be targeted, and you provide information for the armed forces more broadly. And of course there are counter-arguments to that, but the initial first implication of what we're talking about is quite radical, it seems to me.
Okay, thank you. Tanya, I would like to ask you a question as well. And that is actually, it's related to actually the question of why is it that Ukraine is using Telegram? Basically, that's why I've been wondering, because one of the interesting things about, you both talked about how platforms have like their own culture and their own logic. I think one of the interesting things about the Ukraine war is how much it is Telegram that is really the foundational sort of app or platform for both sides. Both Russia and Ukraine are using Telegram, and I guess it's a Russian-made platform, and it's debatable how direct relations there are between Telegram and the Russian government, but it's interesting how popular this platform is in Ukraine. And also, I think just for Danes, it can be a little confusing to understand this platform, just partly because it doesn't really seem to be very algorithm driven. So if you just open up Telegram, it can be really confusing to understand what's going on. So can you please explain why is it that Ukraine is so popular in
I think there's a few reasons why. Partly this has to do with what I said about, there's a long history of using digital media to mobilize civil society in Ukraine, for better or for worse. But at the same time also, I don't think it's a secret. By the time Russia first attacked Ukraine in 2014, and even by 2022, the Ukrainian army, wasn't very well prepared in both material and strategic terms. So they've had to improvise a lot. And actually, just in terms of like civil defense as well, like there's been a lot of improvisation. And some of the digital technology that was kind of introduced, from these bots that allow you to report enemy sightings, which are also posted on Telegram, and some other things, right? They didn't start using them because they were the best or like the most reliable, but just because that was the quickest solution, right? And so in a way, Telegram, which was used in Ukraine as just one of the messengers, but perhaps was one of the more popular ones, also because Ukrainians were also quite into other Russia-produced or, Russia adjacent social media platforms, is that just because, there was that shared linguistic space and like the shared communication space, lots of connections. But obviously with the start of the full-scale invasion, a lot of people started to have their doubts about Telegram, right? Because Telegram itself really likes to say that it's fully encrypted. It's actually not, right? There's only one part of it that's encrypted, and that's the personal chats, and only if you turn on the self-destructing chat function. Otherwise, some stuff is partially encrypted, and the public groups and channels are not at all encrypted, right? So it's actually not as safe as it would like us to think it is. The other problem, obviously, is that it has these constant recriminations that are, made against the founder and his unclear history with the Russian secret services, whether or not they actually have a relationship, whether he was actually exiled and is anti-authoritarian, or whether it's all actually a ruse and he actually still has a relationship with them. We recently learned that even though he left Russia in 2014 and claimed he was pushed out of the country, he actually made about 50 trips between 2015 and 2022 to Russia, which, is a bit strange if you think about it. But I think part of the reason is convenience, right? Is because that's where the audience already is, right? And on social media, if you know anything about, like there were multiple calls for people to leave Twitter when it was turned into X. Lots of people are still on Twitter. Why? Some people like Elon Musk, but very few people, there's lots of people who don't like him or the way he runs the platform, but lots of us are still there, right? And it's this network effect. It's because the connections and the audience are still there, and it's actually really hard to take them with you. It's the same with Telegram, right? So it's being used by Ukrainian government officials, Ukrainian secret services, lots of businesses, local administrations, ordinary users. Everybody's still using Telegram, even though they know that there are certain risks. But it's very convenient, right? Also, the services that it provides, from large channels to groups to bots to all of that, that is all helping Ukraine to run, right? It's knowledge production, it's information exchange, it's planning. So I think, it's kind of a dual-use technology. Yes, it can be used to spread propaganda and help smaller terrorist extremist groups organize in more or less private, but it can also serve, war mobilization efforts and information exchange. So I think, the trade-off there is still something that's under discussion. I don't know if in the long term it will remain widely used. If there is a better alternative or a solution that is found, maybe people will drop it, or maybe something dramatic will happen and it will just become too much of a risk and suddenly it'll be blocked in Ukraine. But that hasn't happened yet.
Okay, thank you, both of you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tanya and Matthew and Anders, for your wonderful presentations. I think I'm up next, actually. It's nothing like shit. So, yeah, from Ukraine to Mali. Last week, BBC reported on how influencers from 8 African countries was on this media tour to Russian-occupied parts of Ukraine, a tour that was organized by the African Initiative, a new Russian media group that is presenting itself as this bridge between Russia and Africa. The influencers visited areas like Mariupol and Donetsk, and they were escorted by Russian officials and the military, of course, with the aim of getting the influencers to see the Russian version of the story, and also to disseminate content of this version on their channels. So this kind of tour illustrates how Russia uses media and cultural program to attract African journalists and influencers into an ongoing information war. But it also shows how smartphones and digital connectivity increasingly connects global conflicts across the world. And in this presentation, I'm going to focus on Mali's influencers. In Mali, we call them videomen. This research is also in one of the articles in the special issue, and it's co-authored with my Malian colleague, Elmami Silla, who could unfortunately not be here today. But videomen, we argue, they serve as an example of how digital media has created a new class of cybercombatants, that is actors who influence conflict dynamics through their virtual presence. So in the next minutes, I'll show very fast how videomen has played a central role in building popular support for the Mali's new military government and its intensified military cooperation with Russia. I think actually many of you, is actually not the guy in the front, is this guy over here. He's a very notable example of Russia's close tie to African influencers. It is Kemi Seba, who's a Franco-Beninese social media phenomena who gained fame between 2018 and 19 with financial help from Prigozhin, founder of the Wagner Group's Africa back office. And on the left, we see Kemi. He's together with Adama Ben Diarra, also called Ben the Brain or Ben le Cerveau. And they're at this meeting celebrating the departure of the UN mission in Mali, MINUSMA. And Ben, he's leader of this group called Yerevolo, which is like the foremost and most outspoken anti-French Pan-Africanist movement in Mali, before he was then arrested last year, which I can come back to. But Kemi Seba has effectively tapped into these deep-rooted anti-colonial feelings to push for an anti-Western revolution. And with people like Ben, he has organized pro-junta rallies in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, and promoting these very strong anti-French messages. But so why is Mali and the Sahel region interesting for Russia? Over the past decade, EU countries have deployed military operations, border control, and aid to curb illegal migration, terrorism, and organized crime. Efforts that has failed to stabilize the region, and instead they have fueled resentment and public protest against Western policies and Western interventions. So even long before the coup in 2020, Malian political movements have called for a renewal of Mali's long-term historical relationship with Russian military cooperation. So after the coup in 2020, the new military government was quite quick to sort of reject European intervention efforts and turn to Russia and the so-called Wagner Group for security support. A shift that we've soon seen continues and followed in Burkina Faso and Niger. And so European policymakers and Western media often link this to Russia's expanding disinformation campaigns, which has also taken speed after the war in Ukraine in February 2020. However, what we try to argue in the article is that beyond external actors' information warfare, we need to recognize and pay attention how local actors and digital processes shape these dynamics on the ground. So who are Mali's videomen here? It's the same meeting. I think Kemi is probably over here now. We see how videomen in the front are streaming the event and sort of disseminating Ben's pro-government propaganda to thousands of users. In Mali, videomen, they live stream during rallies. They document from places where the traditional media has no longer access due to the war. Some sell content to more established channels and news agencies, and others operate more on their own platform. They take advantage of the lack of regulation to write and say what they want, maybe not so much more, but the comparative advantage is that they can reach audiences in the local languages, which makes a huge difference. But the point is also that the global tech industry and the social media economy fuels this videomen business. So in a poor country like Mali, sorry, I just need to have some water, with high unemployment, becoming a videoman is a fast way to gain money, a public identity, and social prestige. And we all know this success depends on numbers of views, which also incentivizes videomen to produce ever more sensational content that grabs attentions and boost revenue. Sorry. And I think we've been on this, that everyone with a smartphone can contribute, but I think our latest research also shows that it's not everybody with a smartphone at hand who becomes successful. Some videomen are being highly professionalized, so they use very professional, very expensive cameras. They have solar panels, they have power generators, which is extremely important in a crisis of energy where access to electricity is quite important for actually having this business running. And they can also afford expensive housing like this one. So we have also kind of traced some of them, the successful ones, careers, and many of them have ties to political parties, socialist movements, and key politicians. And some of them has also been trained as web activists for about maybe 8 to 10 years. So some of them do receive support through like the new Russian media group, the African Initiative. And here we see this nice poster from Gandhi Malian's trip to Russia last year in June. But our interviews also reveal that quite significant revenue they just gained from ads like tea and milk powder products, which they post on their web TV channels and SoMe profiles. So the point is that while we discuss Russia's disinformation campaigns, they don't drop down on an empty plate. This growing influencer industry and digital infrastructure allows both national and international power holders to fund political influence campaigns. So let's go back to Ben Decerveau, leader of Irevolu. He was sort of the creator of the ideological foundation for the Mali coup government, and as an important activist, he caught our attention quite early on in the research. But meanwhile, our online data collection showed, interestingly enough, that Ben and his group, they were not the most active online. So they they rely on influencers like Gandhi Malian. Here he's giving an interview to Gandhi Malian, who has like over 1 million Facebook followers and can boost their content to get a lot of views. And subsequently, we've also seen that Ben has been quite actively supporting coups in Burkina Faso and Niger, but after he criticized the government for not holding elections, he was arrested and is now considered an enemy of the state. So the tides can turn quite quickly, and the Mali new government is also making quite a lot of use of this act against cybercriminality to sort of silence critiques. Meanwhile, Gandhi Malian's commentators accepted the trip to Russia, and they continue to go on these global media tours. One of them is on his way to Iran. So that just shows how these global war zones are connected through individuals. So to conclude, smartphones and the digital media give videomen increased power to influence how people perceive of and participate in Mali's information war and close cooperation with Russia. But while the coup in Mali is often linked to Russia's influence, focusing only on external actors overlooks the crucial importance of influencers and new digital practices in shaping support for Mali's new regime and its quest for a new, less Western-dominated global order. On that note, I'll hand over to you, Michael Ines. Thanks for coming. Sorry.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Mike Innes. I'm a visiting senior research fellow in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. A few years ago, I started a research unit there called the Conflict Records Unit, which looks at a lot of the topics that we're dealing with today. I'm also a working consultant on projects that deal with these same issues. So academically, I'm trained as an historian and as a political scientist, and more recently in law. And professionally, I've been an institutionalized researcher and analyst in NATO at several different headquarters, and with the UN. And all of my work has been sort of somewhere in between those two things. And my real interest in some of what we're talking about today is as an analyst, as a research analyst, having a close understanding of how well or not, more often than not, primary evidence or primary information is acquired and stored and preserved. So wanting to know that that's well done as I do my job as an analyst. But I frequently get pulled into projects that involve digitization of analog documents and evidence in sort of frontier or developing sort of locations to preserve and make digitally accessible, otherwise difficult to access information. So I've done some of that in Afghanistan on a small scale, and more recently in Iraq with UNITAD, where I spent 2 years managing an EU-funded digitization project, a large-scale project. So trying to tie that into what we've been talking about here, we're really talking about mediation and governance at the back end of the process, where all that information dovetails with matters of, different sorts of matters, but increasingly matters of legal consequence. How well we do that has consequences. So, and today is an interesting day, I think, to be talking about that, because it is the very last day today of UNITAD's mandate after 6 years of operating in Iraq. So for just a bit of background for those of you who are not familiar with UNITAD, it's the UN investigative team for the accountability of Daesh, and it's a UN fact-finding mission of a particular sort. Its mandate is derived from Security Council Resolution 2379 from September 2017. And that mandate is to collect and preserve evidence of Daesh crimes in Iraq, with a specific focus on war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And the second part of its mandate is to promote accountability. UNITAD will now go into liquidation, so that the mission is over, and the evidence that it collected has already been deposited at the UN Secretariat in New York. So that's mission information as part of normal mission liquidation, but also with the fact-finding that it did, the evidence collection that it did. That all that goes to New York, and a partial version of that collection goes to Iraqi authorities as well. So at this point, there's going to be the inevitable kind of postmortems about UNITAD's performance and achievements. And a key issue is going to be the continuing accessibility of that pool of evidence in terms of who can go to the archives and research information that's not just archived because it's out of circulation, but it's there and it's live evidence in active prosecutions. So what's the accessibility going to be like, and what is the UN's plan for sorting that out? And reading through the twice annual UNITAD reports to the Security Council, including the final report that was just submitted, you get a bit of a mixed picture, right? And recognizing that these reports are imperfect records of progress or achievement drafted by committee, what stands out for me, the points that I really fixate on, and that I'd like to emphasize and contest, is the idea of the emphasis on comprehensiveness or completeness that might be conveyed. And that UNITAD somehow managed to collect a complete set of evidence covering everything. It had a very specific temporal scope to, Daesh crimes from 2014 to 2017 within Iraq. That was its geographic scope. So it's simply not the case that what they've done is complete, right? And I would encourage anyone using those materials to approach it with a critical eye. More importantly, I think, the operational logic to UNITAD was fundamentally prosecutorial, right? So the driving goal was to compile criminal case files from that evidence and directly enable prosecutions. And that's fine, right? You need some sort of approach to organize things, especially on the scale UNITAD was operating on. But it's not comprehensive. It's organized around the logic is pursuing specific lines of inquiry, specific kinds of crimes in certain areas against certain communities that prosecutors think will be fruitful and achievable in judicial terms. So that's a far cry from compiling and preserving a full picture in evidentiary terms of what happened, broadly speaking. So as investigators and researchers begin accessing UNITAD records, it'll be interesting to see, I think, what they think is missing, if they think anything is missing. Are there missing lines of inquiry? If certain kinds of activities were not investigated and the evidence was not collected, that means there's a gap in this record, right? What about in historical terms? Think about previous documentation efforts, especially large-scale documentation efforts that followed the Holocaust or Cambodia or Rwanda or indeed the Syrian civil war. So memory is always, 2 points, two related points on this. One is that even these couldn't hope to be comprehensive, right? Archives famously are a process of creative destruction. So items that are selected some items are selected for attention, where for every one of those items, other items will not. And so memory is always institutionalized memory in that sense, is always a partial picture, right? And that says something, I think, about managing our expectations about, how much we can expect from democratized media sensing. Just a few additional points. Thinking about all that information dovetails with other matters, right? And often enough matters of legal consequence. If you think about how UNITAD's mission and some related missions have been framed. So Eurojust put out some policy statements and some other sort of guiding documents on what it looks like to be collecting evidence of Daesh activity on the ground. And it was framed in terms of battlefield evidence. And that's an interesting framing, right? It conjoins battlefield intelligence, right? So what you would collect off the battlefield to know more about the enemy as a prospective or forward-looking activity. So how you could use that to gain advantage in military terms, and treating it as evidence that could be used retrospectively in a judicial environment. So that's really, I think, of a moment, right? An increasing forensification of how we approach things like digital media or analog media or things that are sort of in between. And you've got a bunch of examples of this. Probably a good one is the way open source investigations have become a much more highly specialized forensic specialty. You've got civilian organizations like forensic architecture. And so the framing is quite blatant in terms of this expectation of a forensic standard being applied regardless of where researchers are coming from. If they don't have a legal purpose or a judicial purpose or a prosecutorial purpose, there's still sort of an expectation that because of the challenges that come up in these kinds of environments, right? If we're talking about violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law, there's an expectation that even so, you should be collecting your material with a view towards, it potentially being used in some sort of prosecution. So I guess I'll just conclude on 3 basic points, and 2 of them have been emphasized quite a bit. I think one is infrastructure is critical. It needs to be there to support democratized sensing and preserving and sharing of information. And it has to be there to support those efforts to convert non-digital to digital, because it's a mistake to think that it's all digital and sort of neglect everything else. There's a lot that's out there and a lot more that needs to be still sort of preserved and converted into that usable digital format. And the infrastructure needs to be there to make sense of it and to maintain it once it's been processed. So there's a lot that goes on there, and it takes a lot of time and resources. And it tends to be the very dead, boring front end and back end of these processes that nobody wants to deal with. So it tends to be undervalued, under-resourced. The second one is a garbage in, garbage out, right? It's that processing has to happen. If we don't properly process that material as it's collected, we end up having to face that problem later on down the road. And that's something that recurs in all sorts of different kinds of interventions and contexts and what have you. And the last point is that conflict zones I've always thought of them as sort of competitive research environments, where you have different kinds of researchers, investigators, or what have you, working to different purposes and standards and ethics. And in that context, I think forensic standards and expectations, they've been democratized and they've become increasingly the high standard that that all communities of research, I suppose, aim to achieve. And it's a point that's open for debate. I've thought of it in those terms, but it's still kind of a half-formed thought, and I'd be very curious to know your thoughts on that. And that's it.
Thank you very much,
Yep.
Mike. Okay, go get them.
Okay. Hope you're not all sick of smartphones by now. So yeah, I'm going to reflect today on some fieldwork experiences in Somaliland and Somalia, but particularly focusing on the spread and the role of personal digital devices in conflict zones, and specifically how they're, I think, becoming an integral part of what others here today have already described in terms of participatory warfare. A lot of the focus has, for good reason, been on Ukraine, but I also believe that a lot of the dynamics that we're seeing there have precursors, digital precursors in places like Mali, but also places like the Somali territories. So yeah, the background to this research, I was basically in Somaliland in 2021, about 5.5 months of field work for a research project which was not at all on war or the digital or anything like that. It was on how diaspora ties and communities respond to different crises, rather than, for example, the state or international humanitarian agencies. So just very briefly, many of you will know the Somali Civil War began in the late 1980s, continues to this day. The Somali territories are now governed by a sort of patchwork of different political entities. And to make this very brief, the areas I was sort of focused on, a lot of my research was these regions of Sanaag and Sol that you can see there. It's a disputed territory. It was claimed by Somaliland, but also neighbouring Puntland, which is a semi-autonomous state of Somalia. And especially it was focused in the city of Las Anod, where a lot of the infrastructure, which was interesting to us, such as the water supply that you can see there, the electric power plant, some of the roads, they were funded not through the state, not through international agencies, through the community and through the diaspora. Anyway, that happens. I finished the fieldwork. I returned to Denmark. And then in January 2023, the main clan that lives there, the Dulbahanti clan, declared their intention to rejoin Somalia and establish their own state, basically. And this declaration led to an 8-month siege of the regional capital in Las Anod by the Somaliland army. This was characterized, obviously, by physical violence, as you can see, by shelling, by sporadic attacks. But there was also a parallel information war that really took off from both sides, using social media to disseminate various different narratives, to discredit the other side. And I basically find myself sat in Copenhagen being bombarded with images like these and videos. A lot of the key infrastructure that I'd done research on, such as the water supply, for example, in the previous slide, was destroyed. Hospitals were shelled. Many civilians were killed. But a lot of these images and videos were subject to contestation. So some of these were contested by pro-Somaliland groups, by the Somaliland government even, as misinformation. Often it was saying, these images are doctored. Sometimes it was saying that the fighters themselves had sort of destroyed their own houses and infrastructure. So there were a lot of claims being made at this time, basically, some of which were more outlandish than others. There was the classic one of the war is instigated by Al-Qaeda-linked terrorist groups, by Al-Shabaab, for example, but there were even more outlandish ones, which was that China was behind all this localized conflict and so on and so forth. But anyway, I found myself in this very strange position of basically being dragged back into my fieldwork site through social media, right? So, but also sort of becoming part of this polarized conflict as well. So I'd obviously done research there in person, but now I was trying to understand this conflict and what was happening through the prism primarily of social media, which is a different experience, through WhatsApp calls, through messages with people in Somaliland and Las Anod. So I just want to very briefly reflect on this relationship and how that works. Because I think visual media and the media ecologies that connected, for example, far-flung diaspora on the ground to those who were in Las Anod, for example, that became very central to what would otherwise be seen as a probably highly localized conflict. So to illustrate this, I want to introduce Awil. It's not his real name, but I think Awil is interesting. He becomes what I see as a very key actor in this decentralized media ecology. He was very successful in helping to draw in more international attention, also more fighters and more funding for the conflict on the Dulbahanti side. So I'd first met Awil in Las Anod in 2021. He was coordinating diaspora funding for some of the projects that I was talking about, which also use digital platforms, but that's a different paper. So he was born in Las Anod. He moved to the US because of some fighting. Then he returned some years ago, essentially to the place of his birth. But when the conflict broke out, he didn't leave. He stayed in the city, and he would reach out to me quite often and send me these videos and images and stuff. And his job basically there was to map out and to geolocate a lot of the shellings, a lot of the attacks. He would take images like the ones you just saw and document this conflict, basically. He would often call himself a content creator to me. And here he is sort of reflecting on his and others' roles. So he's saying, everybody has an Android or iPhone. We were organizing ourselves on Facebook. There were live streams at the same time. All the Somaliland propaganda, as he calls it, there had to be a counter of that. It was a campaign, each country, each place, I have people. So intonating the diaspora. What Awil basically was part of a wider ecosystem that links the content creators like himself to diaspora groups, which would quite sophisticatedly edit and promote and disseminate various footage. And some of this content was aimed, obviously, at the international community, right, at the UN, NGOs, and so on. But a lot of it was also aimed at raising support internally in the vernacular, within Somalia, attracting fighters and funding and so on and so forth from across the wider Somali region. And he wasn't the only one who was doing this, by the way. There was, you had diaspora coming from the States who would do vlogs and stuff like as the war was going on. But linking to what Matthew and others have sort of said, Awil definitely saw this in some kind of terms as a weapon, right? So he's saying, I was documenting the incidents, I was streaming it online. As the attacks were happening, we were taking the risk, bro. You could hear the bombs, the bullets. Dilbahanti has that warrior in him. So he would run towards the danger whenever there was an attack or something happening, right? And I found this quite interesting. And ultimately, this highly decentralized, but somehow coordinated media campaign by a clan proved more effective. It mobilized a lot of financial and logistical support, a lot of support from the Somali territories, but also the diaspora. And then ultimately in August 2023, they managed to push the army back in a sort of shock defeat. They're now sort of building their own administration. There's this fragile ceasefire that sort of exists to this day. But I think this can be explained to some extent in terms of what Matthew has already pitched to you, his various 100,000 books he has on new war ecology, for example, brought about by readily available, highly connected smartphones that create this digital battlefield that blurs the lines between civilians and combatants, but also between information and weaponry in various different ways. And this, I think, has a number of important implications. I just want to dwell on a few. Firstly, I think this is a case study, as we have seen in Mali, Ukraine, elsewhere. It sort of illustrates various ways in which technology is changing warfare. Not the high-flung AI Palantir stuff, but actually just the mundane connected devices that you have and that increasingly everyone has, with exceptions, of course. But also this, in conjunction with a global network of diaspora, I think is a significant factor here as well. But ultimately, a sort of decentralized clan militia was able to defeat a sort of quasi-state force. And related to that, there are some indications, I think, that the very concept of what constitutes a combatant or a soldier might also be shifting, as digital expertise becomes actually a much more a valued asset on the battlefield in different ways. So is Awil a civilian? Is he a content creator? Is he a combatant? Is he something else? I think these are some of the stuff that the other papers are getting at here. And third, but last but not least, I think that the conflicts that we often forget about or view as sort of somehow on the geographical margins are actually the key sites of innovation. They're front and center to this new kind of networked warfare that we're talking about. Ukraine has definitely captured our attention, and for good reason. But there are many digital precursors, as others have alluded to, elsewhere around the world. And so the final thing I want to reflect on is what this actually means for us as researchers, right, or policymakers, or practitioners, because whether we like it or not, I think we're also part of this new war ecology. It's not just that you have this constant flow of information that you're sort of bombarded with, which can have psychological, emotional toll, blah, blah, blah. It's not just the collapse of the field in that sense, it's also the ways in which, just as civilian and combatant becomes blurred, I think so too the line between researcher and observer and participant perhaps blurs as well, as we also become more embedded in some of these online, offline networks. Thank you very much.
And now Florian Weigand has agreed to give some comments. Maybe Michael, you would join? Yeah, thanks. I'll just leave my smartphone down here.
Cool, thank you very much. These were like 3 absolutely fascinating presentations, and I think you really shed a lot of light on what's happening in very, very different conflict zones around the world. I just want to share two perhaps thematic reflections and then throw some questions at you, and you can pick and choose a little bit what you think is most relevant for you to reflect on. So listening to you, what I really found fascinating and thought was like a absolutely cross-cutting issue across all three presentations was this idea of what I would call international agency. So whether you call it videomen in Mali or content creators in Somalia or this digital forensics in the case of Unitat, you kind of show how smartphones ultimately enable people to have a voice globally, whether we like it or not, or whether we appreciate these voices or not. And perhaps you could even call it kind of more for the practitioners, you kind of smartphones empower people. And they enable local actors to draw in international actors. We saw that in the case of Mali with Russia. We see that, I guess, to some extent with the UN in Iraq. And we see that with the diaspora in Somalia. And vice versa, I guess it also enables the international community or international actors of any sort to kind of influence local dynamics, again, like we see, for instance, with the case of Russia. So whether we appreciate it or not, I think that's kind of what I see as the bottom line of all presentations in a way, and also in a way of the first panel, is that smartphones shift power dynamics locally, but perhaps also globally. And they also provide people with an international voice, and probably people who didn't have much of a voice before. So there is this fascinating agency dimension. And then relatedly, and this didn't come through as strongly, but I was reflecting on that while you were talking. I was really thinking about to what extent smartphones contribute to the creation of international global communities, or whatever we want to call it. So I guess we're all part of certain globalized communities. We all are part of far too many WhatsApp groups. But I think you kind of show how these alliances are forged. And for instance, Jethro, you kind of drawn into these communities that actually seem to be really local, but you become part of this very specific community. But it really made me wonder whether there is kind of the other side of the coin, whether kind of, on the one hand, we have these fascinating new communities, but the impact and conflict zone seems to be so much more profound than in the global north, where perhaps if you have global communities being inserted into local communities, you kind of almost divide more. You kind of enable people to reinforce their identities in already polarized context. You enable people to kind of reinterpret their own history. You might be able to draw in funding for your fighting, and generally perhaps reinforce narratives of us versus them. So I wonder if there's, not wanting to make it negative, but in addition to this kind of international communities, these are created on all these networks, what are the implications really locally? And I would love to hear from all three of you really what you think is, how this is playing out in your case study context. And perhaps adding to that and kind of making it also a bit more tangible for people with a more applied background, I'm wondering, you kind of reflected on this a little bit in your introduction, that it's really important for policymakers, but I wanted to dig a little bit deeper. Whether, for instance, I'm like a diplomat or a peacemaker or work on humanitarian access, and I wanted to stay on top of these dynamics, like understanding connectivity and conflict and how it connects. What should I be paying attention to? And perhaps looking at the three case studies, what are really the key factors if I want to follow this in the future? What really matters? And perhaps for the more academically minded, it made me wonder also specifically with the Mali case study, with this agency that's out there. On the one hand, it really sounds quite romantic, right? It's like almost like, I don't know, James Scott would not appreciate it, but it almost sounds like the weapon of the week, right? The smartphone. But at the same time, it also seems to be, you then also mentioned it kind of ties into party networks, and not everyone has this agency. So perhaps it's also a tool of the powerful. And I wanted to hear your reflections on how you see this tension playing out between whose weapon is it, really? I'll leave it to you to kind of pick and choose what you find most interesting or relevant.
Could I jump in with a quick one? Just going in reverse order, I think starting with your point about... I'm going to throw it back to him now. But also to you, because it's interesting, because you're dealing with something that's active now, talking about video men agency. Yeah. And in Iraq, it's kind of the other way around. It's after the fact. In their day, the Islamic State in Iraq, or Al-Qaeda in Iraq, then the Islamic State in Iraq, and then ISIS, had that agency. It was very, very proactive. with its own media, right, online and in print, and it was extremely active. And now we're at the back end of that, where we're sort of inverting things and taking over that agency. I don't know what to make of that, but it's just a way of sort of, I guess, contrasting it with what you're looking at.
Yeah, so the kind of, but I think the post-intervention perspective is interesting in both cases. But yeah, thanks. Maybe I'll just start. Thanks for some very interesting remarks. And I think I actually also really liked Tanya's expression of the epistemological agency, because I think it is this thing with tech that it has that double side. It has both the dystopia and the catastrophe within it. So I think there's a little bit of a resemblance to like the Arab Spring, where we have all this positive and optimism about the mobilization potential of the global village, and then flipping to the back coin with some very authoritarian pushbacks on that. And maybe we are seeing a little bit of that in Mali as well, that because the videomen became very famous in all these public protests leading up to the coup. So after the coup d'etat, the picture has kind of changed a little bit, and we see a more divided side where some are being promoted and others are being silenced, not as harsh as it's currently happening in Burkina Faso, for instance. So it's of course there's this state and there's this authoritarian pushback, but I also think there's something about just pure global capitalism's kind of superseding democratic efforts. So it's almost Amami and I is always laughing about how now Russia is actually achieving destroying the Western liberal order in Mali by using exactly our most forceful weapon. So I think it's actually both that. It's like both the perhaps the tech utopia, but now we're also seeing some of the more dystopian visions to that. But thanks very much for those reflections.
Yeah, thank you so much, Florian. That was great. I would start just with a little thing, which is something that also was brought up with Tanya and a few others, which is to start thinking not just in terms of smartphones or connectivity or the digital, but also in terms of the platforms themselves. And WhatsApp was never designed to be used to build a school in Somalia, but it works that way. You can build a school by using WhatsApp and by sort of coordinating the funding and so on and so forth. So these structures are sort of dreamt up in Silicon Valley or somewhere else. They are intensely modifiable and adaptable, right? And we need to think about that not just in terms of war and crisis and development, but actually as alternative kind of models of governance in some ways, which they are in some places. So that would be the first sort of thing on that. You also mentioned a voice. So it gives certain people a voice, the weapon of the weak. Yes, but then whose voice and what are they saying? And I think that's also very interesting, because in this particular case study of this conflict, which became very, very polarized very, very quickly, the one thing that both sort of sides agreed on was the negative impact of social media. That was the thing that they sort of agreed on, right? And that tells you something significant, nothing else, basically, in a lot of instances. Yeah, and I think you then become drawn into that. I wrote a piece and it sort of gets carved up and put online in different bits and lists section there and that section there, and that's the sort of fragmentary nature of that. And then finally on the policy stuff, I would say, I think something that we've heard through all papers and we'll hear in the next section as well, is that war and society are just not separate, right? They are part of the same thing. And when you look at something like the smartphone and its implications for that, then that becomes quite self-evident, I think. So in terms of how do we develop policy that when policy structures are inherently divided on international, domestic, online, offline, this or that, how can we start to think creatively about different policy expressions and how to address some of the challenges that connectivity brings in that sense? But thank you.
Yeah, really interesting point about international agency. And just if I can follow my own mind map here, I'm just thinking about the obvious point that comes to mind for me when thinking about international agency and what we're talking about is the narratives that come out of this. And when we're talking about the partial versus complete, always inevitably partial archives or incomplete or selective archives. What are the kinds of narratives that can be produced out of that? And there has been an interest in the closing days or post some of these larger tribunals or missions to use all of that selectively acquired and compiled material to craft a master narrative. But of course, it can't be a master narrative. It's going to be skewed one way or the other. And of course, that's something that applies in Iraq as well. You have, you know, UNITAD's version of things, and then of course you have Iraq. It's going to have its version of what's going on, and then you've got, you know, everybody else. You've got, you know, Daesh will have its own version and had its own version of things that it tried to push out there. So you know, whose agency, whose narrative, and if we follow from Matthew's logic, and I think it's kind of proliferated now, so it's everybody's logic in a way. You know, it's the ubiquity of the technology, the ubiquity of the means. That agency means it's everybody's narrative in a sense. I mean, I don't mean that to sort of, you know, blow that up to the point where it's meaningless, but you know, everybody has a say in what the narrative's going to look like, and everybody has their own little narrative, and you know, what do we do with that? There's a lot to try to cohere and bring together. So, yeah.
Just one little remark on the aspect of peace, because we talked about this epistemological agency, but I'm also sometimes wondering, and this also relates very much to what Matthew's been talking about, like, is this also sort of an epistemological 0 point where we can't detect what happened? So it's, if you look back on the 1990s sort of African peace architectures, was also very much, of course, also learned from the World War, this thing about the truth and reconciliation. So this idea that you need to establish some kind of epistemic point from where we can then reconcile. And this, I think, become increasingly difficult. But Rune promised that he's going to be bringing in a more optimistic point. So we look forward to that. Should we maybe break for coffee, or do you have more?
I think 10 minutes coffee break, and then
we'll be back for a positive view on global tech, maybe.
That was interesting. Nice. Nice. Good.
Good panel.
Yeah.
All right. People are still dialing in from the coffee break. That's all right. Before the coffee break, Signe promised that now we would have the optimistic view, and I'm going to have to disappoint you because I'm also going to be skeptical. But then Lisa has been tasked with thinking beyond the criticism that we present in the article that I will be talking about now. So this talk, as I just mentioned, is based on the article we wrote together in the International Affairs special section that we did. And it's an article that does a deep dive into a specific dimension of smartphone humanitarianism, namely the role of apps, the app interface more specifically. And the article is born out of I think a shared skepticism or frustration with the kind of techno-utopianism that's very prevalent in contemporary humanitarian rhetoric and discourse, humanitarian aid organizations around the world. This is just one example of it, but we thought, seeing the theme of the special section, it would be really interesting to do a deep dive into a donation app. And the way this app is framed by the World Food Programme, we see one example here, also how apps coalesce with celebrity humanitarianism, that's another story. But the way this app is being sold is as an easy, gratifying, fun way to help people in crisis. Right? So this is the whole rhetoric that the World Food Programme is pushing this app with, alongside the huge amount of donations and the huge amount of users. So it's really being framed as a revolutionary tool with which to democratize everyday helping, right? To make it more accessible for more people around the world. And I think we were immediately skeptical of these promises, and so the onset of the article is to provide critical observations about what are the actual political implications if we look at the app itself, if we try to map the functions and features of the app interface, but also the experiences and reflections of potential users. So that's the kind of the data set that is informing all of this. So 3 critical observations before I hand the word over to Lisa. The first thing that caught our attention when we were going through the app was the way that victims of crises are framed on the app. These are just three examples which are noteworthy because they break with this old humanitarian tradition of shock effect campaigns, right? Images of suffering and violence and mutilation, which for a long time played a huge role in humanitarian communication. But recently we've seen, in terms of aesthetics, that humanitarian campaigns have changed from these shock effect campaigns to more kind of a positive message, where it's the hope and the joy and the agency of victims that's been played up. And this is really what these kinds of framings that you're seeing here are doing. So this is distinctive because it breaks with the tradition, right? But it's also distinctive because it stimulates an emotional resonance, a very particular emotional resonance with users that's based on joy and gratitude, right? You don't want to make potential donors feel too bad, right? You don't want to sort of harm the feeling of feeling good when doing good. So this is really in many ways, and this was shared by the users that we talked to, who documented their reflections using the app, that the app does give off this vibe that it's fun and easy and gratifying to help people in need. Not because they're suffering, but because they're happy, agentic individuals. So it's an attempt to make the donor feel good, per se, but also about themselves when they're donating. Now, how do you then actually donate on the app? And this is what it used to look like. Now it's a bit different, but roughly the design principle here is the same. You manipulate a slider with your finger, and the content of the bowl in the middle decreases or increases depending on the size of your donation. So what's happening here is that the World Food Programme has added this design element that encourages users to play around with donation amounts, right? It's fun, it's interactive, it's smooth. And so one of the designers, Tim Höfer, who was implicated in the design of the app, explained that the primary reason for using the slider was to make the impact of donations visible and to increase donation sizes, right? And several of the respondents who shared their reflections using the app also reported that they felt a sense of enjoyment and satisfaction when they could see how their donation translated into food donations, specific food donations. So not rather than just the number, they had a very specific representation. And this is interesting because a lot of scholars of digital media argue that apps and connective media platforms can mobilize a feeling of political agency, right? Making people participate in warfare, but also in helping. So there's a transition here away from this ethics of collective action, which is then changed into a focus on individual gratification, right? And we see this very obvious here, that what this app caters to in the donation experience is designed to cater to a sense of personal agency. I'm doing something, and I can see the immediate impact of this. So it's a practice of what you can call playful consumerism, right? So this is a clear example of how the design of the app enacts this assumption that humanitarian helping should be an easy and gratifying experience for the individual, right? Rather than a collective effort to change the conditions that sustain hunger. Final point that we found really interesting is this profile function. And this is where we move from the actual act of donating itself to the kinds of connectivity that the app encourages users to participate in. And what's really important to note here is that the networks that the app allows people to join are facilitated through Facebook. So the app is connected to Facebook. And this, for many users, kind of added to their felt sense of individual agency with a feeling of being part of something bigger, being part of a community of people who are trying to help. But it also kind of implicitly integrates users into Facebook's data architecture, right? It integrates users, knowingly or not, into a global surveillance capitalism, data capitalism, which feeds on or profits from the data being used here. And this is, I think, kind of symptomatic of a wider kind of aggressive digital transformation in the aid sector towards cooperating with data companies who quite often are criticized for the way they harvest and use personal user data. So these functions make visible that the data extraction and analysis carried out by the World Food Programme and corporations such as Facebook are coming together, right? So surveillance capitalism is also becoming surveillance humanitarianism, right? Over to you, Lisa. Remember to unmute.
Thank you so much. I think I am unmuted.
Perfect.
I appreciate the offer of 3 minutes of optimism. I'm here for that. Those of you who know my work know I find this still to be challenging, but I'll do my best. So, what is wrong with this app has been presented in very short form by my colleague Daniel. I would encourage you that if you're interested, please download and read our article, because we have a lot more documentation about some of the problems that we actually find within the affordances of this particular digital technology. But I was tasked with talking to you very shortly about what could be different. And so I'd like to gesture a little bit to that, referring to these 2 large problematic areas, okay? The first is the representation of what humanitarianism is, who can help, and how. I'll mention that I presented this to my fantastic master's students, some of whom are already here, in a governance and development course at CBS, and the students immediately saw the problematic representations of agency and the lack thereof in the kinds of affordances of these representations. The second is about mobile phone technologies and apps that are part of an increasing humanitarian data profit relationship, which is what Daniel just referred to, the collaborations between companies like Palantir, Google, Facebook, and the World Food Programme. So, on the first, I'd like to look to other intimate technologies, which are quite different than the ones that we've been exploring until now today, to actually try to come up with a different and perhaps more utopian possibility about how we could think about humanitarian communication. And so the first one is about looking at utopian demand in humanitarian communications design. And in going from ideals to action, one useful framework is this framework of utopian demand, which was actually defined by the feminist theorist Kathy Weeks, where she talks about it as a political demand, which takes the form of not just narrowly pragmatic reform, but of a more substantial transformation of the present configuration of our social relations at large. It's a demand that's provocative, that raises eyebrows, that's daring, okay? That's not just something that we would put up expecting immediate success. So examples of utopian demand, just to give you a little bit of a tactile sense of what it could be, would be something like perhaps, well, prison abolition, or perhaps universal basic income. But what's most important is that it's not informed by political feasibility alone. And a lot of us get caught in value for money or political feasibility arguments when what we really need to think about is how to come to different values and understandings and utopian demands. So what I'd like to ask you to do is just suspend for a moment all the criticism that we all have against these technological links in times of peace and war, and think about what kinds of utopian demands we might actually demand of technologies in the future, and who is working and about bringing them about, which is going to get us into the policy realm. So, I know that from the United States these days, we're really seeing mostly memes about who's eating the dogs and who's eating the cats. And for this reason, I wanted to introduce the possibility that there are other realms that we can actually look to for serious communication of humanitarian utopias in going from ideals to action and using this framework. And so this is an example of the American Pavilion at the Biennale in 2022 from an artist called Simone Lee, and her work is entitled Sovereignty. The beauty of solidarity and camaraderie, the decentering of man and of self, could ground utopian demands on humanitarian communications. We could have a different possible communicating spectrum, embodying a decolonized version of transnational helping, perhaps partial and piecemeal, building on actually existing utopias. Perhaps we could find an interclass and intersectional bridging strategy. Looking at different ideals of humanitarianism can help us to demand different things from our humanitarian technologies. Respect, security, and self-reliance may be fundamental humanitarian values. So I'm offering us to think much more provocatively about whether communications could be designed under different structuring logics, where the beauty of solidarity, camaraderie, and the decentering are actually grounding our utopian demands. On the second side, and this is the last one, about the humanitarian data for profit relationship, I'd like to present to you some arguments that I actually have in a forthcoming piece, which is a commentary with our colleague who you'll hear from in a moment, Adam Fireskull from here at DIIS, for a special issue for the journal Big Data and Society, We have a special issue on commodifying compassion in the digital age. And in this issue, Adam and I have written together from our long-standing collaborations and research in the field of tech, humanitarianism, and development. And we make the following provocative arguments. First of all, tech companies need to change. They need to change their basic business practices. And when they don't, governments actually need to regulate them. And I say this standing here on 2 feet, understanding that of course it's difficult to regulate the digital environment, but it is not impossible. And the thing that we argue in our piece is that these relationships problematically are often relationships of intellectual property and labor rights, which already, as we've told, have existing legal contracts together with international humanitarian law. So the other thing is that tech companies should stop trying to help through what they consider to be self-perceived altruistic activities, and instead they need to focus on remaking core business practices. I come from a business school. I'm talking about this all the time. That they need to actually think about how tech companies can make practices in an image of justice, of protection, and of equal value creation, and particularly in contexts which are characterized by vulnerability, which all the contexts we've talked about today, whether they be contexts of peace, contexts of war, or contexts of ongoing humanitarian struggle, are contexts of vulnerability. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Lisa and Daniel, for a very balanced approach. And now Rune Saugmann from Temple University is going to give us his presentation of Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, better? Good. Yeah, I think I might also have to disappoint you a little bit on the positive news at the end part of it, but at least if you happen to be a Black American and die in a violent way that's filmed, there is a little bit of positive spin to that otherwise rather unfortunate situation. So it's not all bleak, or maybe it is. So I'm going to talk about kind of the epistemic technologies that exist in our smartphones. There's only around 16 times I'm going to say smartphones before you guys will have the opportunity to ask all your questions. So we are nearing the end. So I think you all know, of course, the Black Lives Matter movement. And I'm trying to understand basically how it how the relationship between the technologies that came around during the previous decade and why this consistent issue of police violence against minoritized citizens in the US became a movement and an issue in the way it did at the time it did. Right, so I'm going to try to rescue a little bit of the kind of enthusiasm from the early Arab Spring and so on, where we thought that everything will be filmed and therefore all kinds of oppression will go away magically. They won't, but at least there are some kind of like I think epistemic mechanisms that can enable people who previously had very little power to have a little bit more, a little bit different power. So I argue in the paper that the transformation of how police violence against black citizens in the US is understood and articulated as a security issue is due in part to the emergence of smartphones as powerful infrastructures for documenting and disseminating evidence of violence. And I discuss how video especially has become a crucial articulation infrastructure for the Black Lives Matter movement and how it works to challenge historical barriers to black people's ability to voice their security concerns. And also try to, in that, bring in some, Jethro instructed us to be very empirical, so try to bring in some concepts, right? How we can, what kind of concepts can we use to understand these forms of agency that we are talking about? So historically, painting with a very, very broad brush here, right? Black voices have been systematically silenced in public discourse. Du Bois pointed out how even the native elite in colonial society suffered, quote, an inability to speak with recognized authority. I'm totally interested in recognized authority. That's why I like that quote so much, right? Because what is it that gives statements their weight? And I think this is exactly what changes when we're able to film things instead of articulate them in voice, right? Fanon talked about masks, and Ralph Ellison had this idea of the black man as an invisible man. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I think it's kind of something you have probably encountered before, right? So in the around mid 20 or early 2010s, the Black Lives Movement gained prominence, right? And it brought attention to systematic police abuse of marginalized citizens across the US. A key factor has been in this awareness has been the stream of smartphone videos capturing incidents of police violence. These videos have drawn public attention and helped individual cases articulate a broader security issue facing black Americans. After the shooting of Trayvon Martin, which was not something that was initially a filmed event, but I will get back to that. But in the debate after that, the hashtag Black Lives Matter was coined by activists, thereby enabling the issue to be established as an issue, right? Enable all of these discrete, disconnected instances of violence to be actually a security political issue that we then all came to know. There has, of course, always been instances of violence, and there is many different kinds of instances of violence, but this was kind of the connective function of especially Twitter at this point that allowed those discrete events to be grouped as a larger issue. So to understand the connection between smartphone videos and the Black Lives Matter issue, I argue, we need to examine how videos function and smartphones function as articulation infrastructures or epistemic infrastructures. Technologies that are routinely relied upon by activists to facilitate security articulation practices. And I produced a bit of data on that in the paper. I go through what I call a mediagraphy of 34 major Black Lives Matter cases between 2012 and 2023, and find that even if some of them happened far away from cameras initially, video evidence became involved in articulating all of them. Right? Bystander recorded videos were present in 19 cases, while police recorded videos were used in 20 cases. Importantly, in 14 of these, there were efforts by the authorities to withhold or restrict the viewing of police footage. And this was then often only brought out when activists or bystander video could show police filming or could document events in a way that the police felt they had to respond to it. So these videos are also crucial in driving kind of the larger public interest in the Black Lives Matter issues, as I document with Google search trends. So there's two significant spikes in the Black Lives Matter related searches in July 2016 and in June 2020. And the way it functions is that, you know, the largest spike is 100, so it doesn't mean that there's no activity or no interest here where it's completely flat. It's just after the death of George Floyd, it basically, it's so many orders of magnitude larger interest that the rest of the time seems a little bit flat. The first spike was 2016 that coincided with the smartphone recorded killings of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile. Especially the Philando Castile case shows the power of the smartphone media ecology, as it was mediated by Castile's girlfriend, Diamond Reynolds, live streaming the immediate aftermath of the shooting. They were inside a car together. She was live streaming her interactions with the police afterwards on Facebook Live. And now the second and much larger case in June 2020 followed the killing of George Floyd. And I'm now going to show just a still from that video. It's terrible. If anybody has been subjected to racist abuse or something, police violence, it might be a slight trigger. So I will just warn you in before showing the image. But this is this was captured by multiple bystander videos, including one that showed 8 minutes and 46 seconds out of the actual 9 minutes and 29 seconds that a police officer was kneeling on George Floyd's neck while he was begging for his life, to which the police officer then responded, then stop talking, it takes a heck of a lot of oxygen to talk. This, I think, is of course a terrible quote, but it also again exemplifies this way in which that black people's voices are not taken always seriously as kind of security articulation. Right? This is completely brushed off that the person is actually begging for his life. So these examples illustrate how smartphones have become dependable articulation infrastructures that are active in articulating the Black Lives Matter case, combining recording, processing, distributing, and viewing capabilities in a single device, as I think we have been talking about now for a couple of hours. Right? Now, the second part of it is why video in particular has been so effective in articulating Black Lives Matter as a security issue. And I argue that this is because video possesses a unique epistemic authority due to its perceived naturalistic quality. It seems a copy of reality. This epistemic authority, I argue, allows video to function as an infrastructural gateway. That is a gateway between the gap that can bridge the gap between personal and vernacular articulation in different social media systems, or chat channels and whatnot, and public security debate formats on the other side. So this connection is quite hard to make, but video is able to make that. To some of the early scholars on infrastructures, an infrastructural gateway is something that permits multiple systems to interoperate and both establish a planned technical configuration and at the same time select and configure together an array of social and political actors. So it's a socio-technical device that reconfigures the participants in the debates that it mediates. This is exactly what I think is happening in this issue, right? Gateways are often wrongly understood as technologies, that is like hardware or software alone, but a more accurate approach, these authors continue, conceives of them as combining a technical solution with a social choice. That is like a standard, both of which must be integrated into the practice of the users. So the fusion of technical compatibility standards, image formats, internet protocols, smartphone configurations and the like, and epistemic compatibility or belief in images enable videos to bridge personal articulation with public security debate formats, bridging the gap between personal vernacular information and public security debate formats. So video, I was going to see if I have to change, I think so. Video enables articulations of police abuse to migrate from social media to mass media, expanding the possibilities for racialized and minoritized populations to articulate their security problems. The multimodality and sequentiality also limits to some degree the reinterpretation and recontextualization that can take place in public debate, so providing something like a voice narrative that goes along with the visual evidence. However, there are some limitations to what these to what the video articulations can do, and I'm not going to argue that smartphones or video is that tech fix that disabled racist structures. Most importantly, as I said, they rely on extreme and most often deadly violence, so it overlooks all the non-lethal abuse and everyday institutionally racist policing practices that also exist in American society. And additionally, the black and most often dying protagonists, of course, remains exhibits in some kind of way, rather than people with their own voice and agency that can take part in determining what happens to their story. So in conclusion, smartphones and video have reconfigured how marginalized populations can articulate security issues. By acting as articulation infrastructures for Black Lives Matter, smartphones have enabled hitherto marginalized populations to co-constitute security reality by documenting the violent repression they suffer. They are then still far more powerless in getting to respond to that reality, right? But just the establishment of a reality that then needs to be responded to in politics is at least a little bit of the power. This all has important implications for understanding the relationship between images and international relations. While some scholars argue that images require accompanying political speech to be relevant within security or foreign policy, I think that this case demonstrates that articulation infrastructures in smartphones can both constitute in video and name in social media debate the security realities. Marginalizing vernacular media then risks what Nandita Behera calls the coloniality of power, where state and academia have both become complicit in epistemically silencing the voices of common people. So I think the BLM movement provides a powerful example of how articulation infrastructures can challenge existing power structures and bring previously invisible security realities to the forefront of public consciousness. It shows that we need to continue to examine how technologies and media practices work together to shape our understanding of security. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rune. And now for our final presentation, we are very privileged to have Denmark's acting tech ambassador, Ditte Bjerregaard, here to present.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate being here today, listening to all your important research in the role of technology in today's conflict and crisis, how it changes maybe not the basic conflict, but how it impacts the dynamics and the risks with speed, with scale, with connectivity, not only through social media, but also through this very powerful hardware device. The first thing many of us will bring out of a burning house, besides our children and pets. What I really also appreciate with today's subject is it very much connects as a practitioner, my present with my past, with my present job. I started 25 years ago working as a humanitarian in many of the conflicts you have been talking about today. South Sudan, in the Palestinian territories, Somalia, Somaliland, Rwanda, stayed 2 years in Afghanistan, working on returning Afghans to a still more bleak future. Now Taliban's back. Worked 3 years in Nepal, supporting a rebuilding of a country that had been torn by civil conflicts. And this was before digital connectivity really kicked into the dynamics. Actually, I've often felt that it was more the challenge with it was forgotten conflicts. Very hard to get the attraction of the global audience after maybe a few headlines. I got a small taste of news traveling fast in Afghanistan with Mohammed crisis, hiding a little bit for a while. And I had my fair share of trying to get these old satellite phones to work in different deserts. And here we are today, not long ago since these days. Many of the conflicts, unfortunately, are still there, but definitely we see these new dynamics which you have shared with us today. So, working with tech diplomacy, I'd like to maybe underline 3 main points here that we often bring with us when we talk with the institutions, with other diplomats, with governments. One very important is the exponential speed, scale, and depth of the tech development that we are experiencing right now. How it really is defining our future, our economy, our societies, our security and global role. And I actually think there that the ChatGPT moment we had helped us a little bit. We have been doing this since 2017, but we really see how we think our important messages are easier digested now. There we saw in 1 year AI moving from the basements of the engineers to really the top floors in the EU, in the US, in the UN. And I think also, if you try to read the Draghi report on competitiveness, you also see that this is really a wake-up call to Europe. Another main point for us is to look at the actors. the actors leading the tech development, the research and development, the commercialization, these are mainly the private tech companies, especially in the US, and not governments anymore, also in the security realm. And you have to ask yourself, who has the most influence, the one who develops the algorithm or the one who tries to regulate it afterwards. There I think also Ukraine has been an important lessons learned on the role that the US big tech played, especially in the beginning of Russia's aggressive war on Ukraine. Of course, there's the famous example of Elon Musk, the dialogue on Twitter, providing vital connection to the front lines. Many other big tech companies was involved, Microsoft, Palantir, Amazon. It was cloud infrastructure who saved much of the data, and also defending, of course, cyber attacks. And I think this also really underlines the importance of trying to look into new partnerships in the governance structure and also the speed of the development. And not least, we see the amazing innovation in Ukraine and how important that is, how they use the drone technology to fight off warships in the Black Sea. A third point, maybe it's a little banal, but it's really the dual-use nature of these transforming technologies, which I think your research also underlines, maybe more on the negative side, but we do also actually insist on the positive side. Maybe it's difficult when you look at conflicts, but if you look into other areas, the possibilities on climate, health, education, they are enormous. And I think what's happened is that this very simple point might be forgotten in the years of the rolling out of the internet, the smartphone, but you actually see that change now, that when you look at some of the new frontier technologies, there's much more conscious about how to build in safety and address this. So, from the very first technology of human history, harnessing fire or making stone tools, to the most advanced technologies of today, technology has been dual-used in nature. A stone axe used to cut down trees to build shelter was also a powerful weapon at that time. You have the nuclear power, abundant source of renewable energy, but also the key ingredients in the deadliest bomb known to history. And next, we might see how generative AI and biotech working together to unlock cancer treatment and diagnostics to the benefit for millions of people globally. But there's also this risk that we are seeing into right now, how AI can also risk producing some of bioweapons and so in the hands of people who really don't want to have them. So fact is, technology that can yield peace, prosperity, and opportunity can in equal measures do the opposite. And then I want to share with you how we in the tech diplomacy often picture the world. We think this is important to understand who are really driving the technology development and how do we act in Denmark, in Europe, in this situation. So we have a time right now with the geopolitics being very much back. New and emerging technologies have moved very much into the center of this global rivalry, especially between US and China. And this is not least due to the dual-use nature of the technology, both on the economic and military advantages that it brings along. Interdependence is no longer a one-way street to prosperity. It's a two-way street which also comes with vulnerabilities and dependencies. So much of the most valuable companies in the US, there we see innovation, we see scaling. In March I just visited China. It's a little bit of another story, but the ability to grow technology, to produce, to scale, and then to export. Maybe not, do they not have the edge of the technology still, but they are really also working in a complete different way than us with self-sufficiency, something that we are starting to look into now, which you can see they for decades have been working on. And then where does it leave us in Europe? I think we have many strengths. It's a skilled population. We are very digital. We have powerhouse science and use a lot of money in innovation. But unfortunately, we have not managed to commercialize and to scale tech solutions. And these are some of the points that Draghi also makes in his very timely report. But we don't have much time, so getting back to the conflict, the crisis. What we see is that nation states remain the central actors in new conflicts. New technologies have, as you pointed to, empowered non-state actors, created new vulnerabilities, and expanded the role of also private companies. AI, drones, biotech are reshaping conflicts, but they are not so far decisive on their own. And they create both opportunities and vulnerabilities. And we see these tech companies, Microsoft, Starlink, Palantir, playing a more active role in some conflicts. We've seen it in Ukraine, also in Israel-Palestine, and it also raises a lot of ethical and gray zone areas for them also. When do they become an actor themselves? So in very few years, we have come also to see these advanced technologies, artificial intelligence, biotech and quantum technologies in a new light. A light of more national security, and where we also see this decoupling happening and a start of fragmentation. I think the clearest example is on the semiconductors, the move towards producing more ourselves, even though it will be a very hard task, though. The US has started so. EU have our own CHIPS Act. We have export controls to try to, from the US to China, to try to slow down the development. On the AI, right now we see some interesting dynamics. We have the rivalry, the competition, but we also still in the UN have consensus on some key documents that we are trying to keep. So and then for the future, I brought in quantum because this is a priority in our new strategy. We'll have to see, but this is the question. This is the super weapon struggle we will see in the future. It's still early days. So this is really taking up a lot of our energy and time, and also feeds very much into our new strategy, which were published here in March. Some of you have followed us for some years. And can see that we have changed a little bit of focus, narrowed it down in some aspects. This is our vision. I will go straight to our priorities. This both illustrates that it's become a more geopolitical world. These new frontier technologies have moved into the center of foreign and security policy, but also when we talk about regulation, we have actually regulated a lot in Europe, and we have shown the way that this can be done. It has been needed, and now it's here. And I think one of the main thing now is to let them to get them implemented, and this will be a high focus for all of us in Europe for the next couple of years. So this also means that before we were more tech agnostic, more focusing on the dialogue or on the need for regulation with the tech industry. We have a team in Silicon Valley on 5 people. Then we have an office here in Copenhagen. So what we have done is to keep this as our raison d'etre, the dialogue with the tech industry. This is still very much the heart, the beating heart of tech. This is where we started and we'll continue. But we will also engage more in the dialogue in Europe with the tech industry and also more globally. Then also, of course, we have focused more on these new and critical technologies, especially AI and quantum. The governance part, we work very much with creating partnerships with like-minded countries, EU strengthening focus on these technologies, partnerships, but also globally. Now I'm going to UN here Friday, where we also have a lot of dialogues, also more globally. If you look at our new Africa strategy, we have also pushed for a tech chapter to be incorporated in our engagement there, because this is really what we also hear from our African colleagues. They want an equal partnership on this. And then, of course, the security policy is also important part of our work. I think very much what we contribute with is very much bringing the convening power and bringing these new type of partners together, bringing the NATO Assistant Secretary General to Silicon Valley and having engagement between many of these innovative companies and NATO and trying to support new type of partnerships. And then finally, of course, we are working very much on the global norms and partnership, especially through the EU and supporting a stronger EU on the global scene. This was a speed to the strategy and the global world. I didn't have more time, but I hope you got a little bit of sense of what we are doing. Thank you.
Tech ambassador here, leader of the tech group that volunteered to sort of about. So we'll go directly for some discussion and some questions from you guys. Yeah. Because and afterwards we will continue chatting over wine on this.
So I'm supposed to.
Yes, or you can have a seat. Are we all gonna go? Yeah, we're all gonna go.
Yes, everybody on the stage.
Ah.
Okay, so I have the unenviable role of not being able to ask questions myself, but facilitating your questions. As we are slightly over time, I want to...
Have a nice
we had a very optimistic agenda.
Right, yeah.
Yes, indeed. We're going to be this way? Okay,
I think
good.
So people in the online audience cannot ask any questions, so the floor is all yours. I do want to impose one basic rule, which is to ask one question and to ask a question. So no long commentaries with personal reflections, please. Raise your hand and then we'll take maybe 3 or 4 initial questions from the floor. Can be from practical, you know, how do you use your smartphone to support the right side in a conflict besides throwing it? Can be theoretical, do we need marks to think about, you know, how technology enables the destruction of nation states in the global periphery? Anything goes. Now's your opportunity.
Yeah, we will sit up there. So the pressure's on you now.
Right, yeah. Right, yeah. Yes, we have a question over there in the back. Please introduce yourself.
Hello everyone, my name is I'm an associate professor at Royal Danish Defence College. And I will try to be speedy with my question and not so much of a comment. So what I would like you to discuss, because we talked a lot about, or you have talked a lot about what are the similarities between the different studies. But I also feel, or at least I hear, coming from a sociological, anthropological background, a tension that goes to the extent to which this is more a global phenomenon and the extension to which level it is detached from local issues of power and relationships. So there's one argument that this is radically changing the way that we do warfare, which an argument which seems to me, my understanding, a little bit detached from the local lived lives. And then we have other more kind of locally grounded studies that says that this spills into local power structures and so on. So I feel, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel that there is a tension or a different perspective in the different presentations. Could you discuss this relationship between the global and the local versus engaging in existing power structures, or whether it creates agency for something new? Was that now you are silent.
Excellent question.
Who wants to take that one?
Should we try to collect a few more questions?
Matthew, are you?
I can give an answer if you want.
Sure.
Yeah. So, okay. What I was going to say was, I think the way we framed this, the way Andrew Hoskins and I framed this in Radical War was to talk about new war ecologies, where some of the references to the stack and all of this other technical infrastructure, it all happens locally as much as it is globally, right? So it comes together under local conditions, and that absolutely means you need to study the new war ecologies. There are multiple places and spaces that need to be engaged with, and whilst they may have similarities in terms of technical infrastructure, they are unevenly distributed around the world. And that unevenness means that knowledge production works very differently depending on where you are in the world. And I think, to be honest, you can see all of that very nicely in all of the papers that were discussed here. So, you're right that there's a tension, but the tension is actually just that we actually need to study digital life in other parts of the world and be less Eurocentric about it, and reflect on the fact that people live through their devices in different kinds of ways. I mean, there are parallels, but how they happen in practice needs to be reflected in how the technology is used by particular cultures and communities. And of course, it has a globalizing effect as much as you're seeing diasporas working with local communities to shape politics, and it brings people much closer together as in sometimes positive ways, I think. But also, there is the potential for these things to work very negatively or detrimentally. So that would be my initial answer to your question, and I'm sure everyone here will have a different take on that. But
yeah, I would just jump in on that a little bit and say that one of the things that we found from the Somali context, at least, which was quite interesting, was, okay, everyone's now using WhatsApp groups, people are much more connected in that sense together, but at the same time, what it actually did on the ground was to actually reify or to intensify the relationship to place, to locality. So it made competition between town A and town B much more dynamic and much more important and significant and much more globalized, because it was able to send videos and images of those places in real time to people in Oslo and people in Toronto, people in the Gulf states, for example. So there is that interesting sort of dialectic in a way where you have, yes, more of a sort of transnational community, but an intensification and an intensified attachment towards place and the way that sort of evolves differently. So yeah, that would be just what I would add in on that, but no sort of disagreement with what Matthew said, really.
Amazing. Anybody else want to chip in, or should we open up again?
I suppose my 2 cents worth is yes and yes. I mean, there are multiple cross-cutting tensions, vertically, horizontally, and I think to pull it back to the theme of this, and especially this guy's points, which I think nobody will have missed at this point, is that it all comes together in a smartphone because it's such a coalescence of conveniences, and in a way that's the lens to see a lot of this through. Yeah.
I just had to sense, thinking about the question that our discussant asked, and he said, well, we think of the internet as this borderless thing. I mean, it's global, but it's not actually borderless, right? To the point where even the smartphone will look different and feel different, because suddenly people realize that national app stores have different apps, and depending on which SIM card you have or which network you're connected to, you are or aren't able to download and use certain apps, and that completely changes your experience. So even if the platforms and the devices seem global, right, we still have these borders which are not always tangible, and yet they really circumscribe people's experiences locally and nationally. So I think that's very important to keep in mind. And the jurisdictions as well, right, where you can get in trouble for different things in different countries.
Great. Any other questions?
Otherwise, go grab a copy of the special issue and dive into more case studies.
Well, join me in applauding for them. They did such a great job.
you.
Congratulations.
Well done. Well done.
And there should be some free wine.
Yeah. Thanks for staying for a long time.